Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we are reading issue 103, and just a little catch-up on what's been going on. In the last issue, we saw John feeling not quite like himself ever since he separated himself into two beings. One was all the good stuff, one was all the bad, and he sent this bad side to take his place in hell with the first of the fallen. And ever since then, he just doesn't feel the same. It's like a little piece of him is gone, specifically the fighting piece, because that is the piece that kind of drives him and gives him this attitude and ability to be able to fight these demons and care about things. So in the last issue, we saw John flipping a coin, but the coin kept coming up the same every time he flipped it. And so he went to his friend Wong's to see if he maybe had an idea of why this was happening. And Wong gave him some advice to follow some parts of the I Ching that John remembered from when he was younger. The first of which was find your thunder or lightning. And in the last issue, we saw John do that because he decided to go to Ravenscar, which was the insane asylum that he was held at after Newcastle. And he spoke with the doctor there that abused him to remind him who he was back then, which I guess helped him find himself now in the present. And that is where we left it off in the last issue, with John following Wong's advice and trying to find these different aspects of the I Ching in his personal life. So we start off with issue 103. We got the cover. We see John is walking on a beach. Behind him, it looks like there's some sort of fishing village or factory, and the tide is pulled out, so he's kind of walking on wet sand. And below the sand he's walking on, we see a skeleton has been buried and is being eaten by worms. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Sean Phillips. And as we turn to the first page, we see it is 1979 in November, and we see a family standing around a snowy grave, and there are people outside of the gates of this funeral that are watching it take place, and they look kind of angry as well. And over these panels, we get some narration that says, "She was just unlucky, they say. They say she'd have lived if they had caught that horrible murderer one day earlier. You never think it could happen to such a nice, pretty young girl. At least, not with what these police can do these days. Did you know they can trace a man by his, well, you know, his love stains? They say she just won a scholarship to Cambridge, too. The poor little lovely. The papers have christened her Golden Girl. Everyone's saying it now. Everyone but Trevor Pritchard. He's calling her victim number 8. So in the panels below this narration, we're seeing a little child that I'm assuming is this woman who was murdered's child, and he looks very sad standing at the grave. And then we get a shot of the crowd who have amassed outside of the gates of the cemetery, and we see one of the people is not really paying too much attention. He's watching from a distance, and he's smoking a pipe. Then we cut back to the grieving family, and the narration continues. Trevor studies the typical Midlands trash father. His daughter's new home is a hole in the ground, yet he's still wondering what he could have done to save her. Daddy stands firm with the eyes of Britain trained upon him, the stupid burly bastard and his working-class bravado. Better than thinking about his daughter's final moments, Trevor supposes. Better than listening hopelessly to the echo of her screams as the madman's bayonet opens her up like a tin of sardines. Better than imagining her glistening intestines spilling out through the gaping hole in her stomach, like big silver worms fighting for position in a nice cozy nest. And what about Mummy? She's hidden behind a haze of Valium pills and sleepless nights. At least this way, she won't have to think about the animal who butchered her little girl. All this attention because a lunatic decided to explore the power of his masculinity. All this wailing and gnashing of teeth because the police couldn't catch him quickly enough. All this for a corpse who went from golden girl to worm food in the space of a few precious hours. The bumbling twits in charge of the investigation had finally found their man, quite by accident. As it turns out, he was picked up for speeding near Leicester, a day late, 24 hours, 1,440 minutes, and only Trevor knows why. Trevor has a secret, but he can never tell a soul. This was all his fault. So as the images of this funeral begin to wrap up, we see the child bend down to the grave where his mother is being buried, and he picks up a worm off the ground. And then after the family is about to leave, we see the people at the gates beginning to pull out cameras because I guess they're members of the press, and they begin to snap photos. But in the background, we see the old man who was smoking a pipe just kind of smile to himself and walk away. So it seems that this man is Trevor Pritchard, who is the murderer of this girl and the serial killer who's been at large. Then we cut to John Constantine, who is sitting at a table, drinking a pint, smoking a cigarette. And as he smokes, his narration says, "Trying to describe the Synchronicity Highway is difficult. It's like trying to bite your own teeth. You move and stand still at the same time. Road signs zoom past before you can read them, but you know where you're going without ever having traveled this way before. Having said that, I'm lost again, which, as all experienced cosmic travelers know, is exactly how it should be. I've let myself be hypnotized by the steady hum of traffic, but now I'm emerging into an awareness of self, somewhere near the turnoff to my next destination. It's all up to me from here. Makes me bloody wish I'd learned how to drive, really." And pretty much in these panels, we're just seeing John think to himself with his eyes closed. And we also see on this page that this issue is called Difficult Beginnings Part 2, The Trouble with Worms. Then we turn the page and we see John is thinking about what happened in the last issue, because we get a flashback of John sitting on a bench in a park flipping a coin, then the coin landing in specific ways, then him talking to Wong, and then him going to Ravenscar. And over these panels, the narration says, "Ah, well, it was bound to happen, wasn't it? Must have been that wrong turn I took somewhere around childhood. Probably the decision to follow my instincts that sent me astray in the first place, eh? Now I'm speeding headfirst into oncoming traffic, hot on the heels of my rapidly departing destiny. The way's pretty clear. The directions have been laid out by a series of trigrams that represent my ultimate fate. I've followed the trigrams to my place of Earth, and I've been to Thunder in search of clues to natures of evil. I've studied the mixed-up nutjob that was my former self, but learned nothing I didn't already know. So here I am, halfway across the country on my journey of rediscovery, following a crumpled roadmap called the I Ching. Next stop, my place of water. It's where I'll find more of my missing self. And so, I look to the horizon for a glimpse of my destination, but for some reason, all I can see is worms." Then we turn the page and we cut to an older version of the man who was smoking in the flashback at the cemetery, and he is walking on a beach in work clothes. He has a shovel in his hands and a pail, and it looks like he is going digging for worms along the shoreline. And as he walks and smiles to himself, the narration says, "Trevor Pritchard lives the best of lives. He's always in control. He carefully ponders matters of life and death and decay, secure in the knowledge that entropy is the natural order of the universe." Then he stops walking for a minute, and he puts down his pail, which is full of worms, and he pulls a worm out, and he looks at it, and he says, "Hello, little worm." Then we get some flashes of what's appearing in his mind as he's smiling, and we're seeing flashbacks of horrific images of dead women and policemen trying to solve a crime in the 70s, and a worm wriggling through the tendons and muscles of a hand as it decays underground. And over these panels, the narration says, "As always, Trevor's thoughts shift to the insolent nightmare that continually tugs at the back of his mind. He thinks of 1978, 18 years ago, 216 months. Victim number 7, 19 years old. Her distraught brother had threatened to castrate the worm responsible for his sister's dismemberment. Trevor remembers the luscious tightening he felt in his testicles as he watched the evening news. A flash of inspiration, a rather wonderful idea. For 3 years, the butcher had terrorized the entire Midlands. 36 months of wasted police manpower. For 3 years, Detective Constable Bill Ferguson, the officer in charge of the investigation, had exhausted all leads, chased every red herring. For 3 years, DC Ferguson had waited for this moment. Then we cut to a flashback of that police officer, DC Ferguson, as he's listening to his messages play back on his answering machine, and one of them says, "Hello, Bill. I can see you're having trouble catching me. And the officer, of course, has a very surprised and excited look on his face. Then we get a shot of that same officer giving a speech at a podium, probably to the press, about making contact with the serial killer. And the narration continues saying, he'd been totally convinced of the tape's authenticity, of course. The poor bastard had so wanted to catch the killer, you see. It had become the very reason for his existence. 10,000 hours of manpower, an army of 37 investigators, a reward of £1 million. A day late, a penny short, a dead girl, all because of Trevor Pritchard. Then we come back to present-day Trevor, who's just reminiscing about the good old days when he couldn't be caught as the serial killer, and he takes the worm that was in his fingers that he was talking to, and he shoves it in his mouth, and he bites down on it, and we see some blood come out from his lips. But then he's pulled from his thoughts as two children run up from the beach, and they yell to him, "Grampy, Grampy!" And as he picks up both of the young boys, he says to them, "Hello, you little worms. Where's your granny, And then he sets them down on the beach, and they go running away from him, and as they run, he yells, "You tell her the old man will be indoors as fast as his legs can manage." And as the children runs away, we get a panel of Trevor just standing by himself on the beach, and then it zooms out more and more so that you can see there's definitely no one else on this beach, and there's just a little speck of him, and the narration says, "Poor Trevor. He's the most evil man in Britain, but he can never breathe a word." Then we turn the page and we cut to John, who is still in that pub thinking to himself, but we see it is at the same beachside town that this Terry Pritchard lives at. Because as he looks out the window, we see he's looking at a sign that says Pritchard's Bait and Tackle. And as he's kind of lost in staring at that sign, we hear someone say, "Oh, what seems to be the trouble, sir?" And then weirdly, he repeats it again saying, "What seems to be the trouble, sir?" "Sir?" And he says that very confused, almost like he's mistaken John for someone else. And the man has a very blank stare on his face, and John looks at him and says, "What? Oh, right. A pint of Guinness, Keith. And get one for yourself, eh?" So Keith walks off, and he quickly comes back with a pint for John and himself. And once again, it seems like he's fighting something as he says to John, "2 pints of Guinness, then. I do hope we're not planning on driving home in that state, miss." And then John turns away from Keith, and he looks back at the sign that says Pritchard's Bait and Tackle, and he says, "Don't worry, mate. We're not going anywhere." So it seems John has hexed this man Keith and made him think he was serving a woman. And as we turn the page, we see Keith has sat down at John's table, and John is talking to him. But from the look on Keith's face, it still looks like he's under some kind of spell and not really sure who he's talking to or what he's saying. So as they talk, John's narration says, "Funny how life works, really. Take this poor sod, for instance. Right now, he thinks he's sitting by the side of the M4, eating a ham sandwich. Well, some of him does. The rest of him is enjoying a pint in a nice warm pub in Lincolnshire, confused and aware at the same time. I know just how he feels. Still, it's all part of life's rich pattern, as they say. It's how we get to where we're going. We pick up little bits and pieces along the way, and arrange them into a completed single image. A ghost of an idea here, a snippet of information there, a memory of something that happened years ago, and before you know it, a conclusion. You're sitting in a pub in Lincolnshire, and the whole sordid story's just fallen right in your lap." And as John is narrating this, we are seeing that he is feeling these flashes of horrible imagery. We're seeing a bloody arm sticking out of a bathtub. We're seeing a knife and a tape and pictures of girls and newspaper clippings that talk about a butcher. So I believe John has been drawn to this place because of this serial killer that was never caught, and it seems he has been able to pinpoint who this man is in this town. So John takes his last drink of his pint, and he looks at Keith and he says, "Come on then, mate." And Keith looks up and says, "Where are we going, Sarge?" And John replies, "To see a man about a girl." Then we come back to the beach where we see Terry Pritchard is walking on it with his pail and shovel, and he's getting worms again. And the narration over these panels says, "Day late, penny short, dead girl, little worms." And as he's digging for worms in one spot, he finds the rotting body of a fish carcass, and he gets freaked out, and he kind of kicks at it with his boot, and he says, "Ah, don't laugh at me. I didn't mean it." Then he walks back to his tackle and bait shop, and the narration repeats, "Day late, penny short, dead girl. And then Terry, under his breath, says, little worms. And as he walks into his bait shed to put his worms away for tomorrow, we hear John say behind Terry, hello, Trevor. I know what you've done. And Trevor is, of course, surprised, and he pulls up his shovel like he might hit John, and he says, who the hell are you? I warn you, I'm a bit bloody handy with this. And John, who's not scared at all, says, I doubt it, you old prat. And then he pulls out a cigarette and he lights it and he says, look, just lose the heavy object and shut your gob for a second, eh? I need to talk to you. And Terry kind of lets down his guard and he puts down the shovel slowly and he says, what do you want? And John repeats the narration that was going on before. Day late, penny short, dead girl. Too bad. Fact is, Trev, I know all about you. At least, I know what you did. And maybe that's why I ended up coming here, mate. I need to know more. So why don't you go ahead and tell me? And then John, who's standing by a desk, reaches over and he turns on a desk lamp, and then he turns the light onto Trevor like he's interrogating him. And as Trevor shields his eyes from the light, he says, you wouldn't understand. And John looks at him and says, try me. So Trevor sits down and he says, all right. What do you know about worms? And as John puffs his cigarette, he says, they live in the ground. Why should I care? And then Trevor actually pulls out his pipe and he begins to light it. And he says, no, you see, I knew you wouldn't understand. To put it very simply, they are the most industrious of all of God's creatures, laddie. And most important, they are wonderfully adept when it comes to hiding the evidence. Then we get some flashes of Trevor's memory as he thinks back to when he was sending clues to the newspapers and to the police, and his narration to John continues. I was in rep theater, you know. I was a good actor, even if I do say so myself. Could have made it onto the television if I'd wanted to. Trouble was, I didn't know any of the right people. But I needed to prove it to myself, you see, and that's why I sent my tape to the police, claiming to be the butcher. Bloody fantastic Brummy accent I did. The police were convinced, of course, and my voice sent shivers up the spines of 50 million viewers. The police spent the next 6 months trying to track me down as the killer. After the butcher killed that last girl, I heard something on the radio. It would never have happened if the police hadn't been fooled by the hoaxer's tape. I can't tell you how vindicated I felt. The idiot in charge of the butcher investigation, Bill Ferguson, his name was, never forgave himself for being conned by the tape. Cut his wrists in the bathtub, as I recall. I've often wondered how he must have felt in his grave when the worms first got to his genitals. So basically, Trevor's trying to say that he didn't actually kill these women. He was just the guy who recorded the tape because he was an actor who never made it, and he wanted to see if he could fool them with his acting skills. But it doesn't look like John believes it, and as John stares at him intensely, John's narration says, I studied this loathsome old bastard carefully, realizing that this is the first chance he's ever had to brag. My instincts scream for me to hit him right in the kisser with his garden spade. It's a temptation that's hard to resist, but it's why I've come to this place of water, you see. I've come to study clever Trevor, and relearn what I've forgotten about wickedness and spite. I've sorted all the jumbled images and snippets of information, and there's only one conclusion I can make. And as Trevor sits smugly smoking his pipe, looking at John with a smile on his face, John says to him, all you are, mate, is a coward. And this gets a rise out of Trevor, so Trevor stands up and puts his finger in John's face and says, now just you look here. But John cuts him off, yelling back, bollocks. I can't stand jumped up amateurs like you, Trev. You give the really nasty ones a bad name. You made one mistake and now you can't hack it. You've retreated into insanity as a fucking defense mechanism. I tried that once. Didn't work for me though. Then John reaches down into the bucket of worms and he puts his hand into it and he begins to feel the worms wriggling around his fingers and he says, see, I've long since learned you have to pay for your mistakes. Otherwise, what's the bleeding point? You, Trev, you just want to hide behind lies and blame it all on the worms. But that's the trouble with worms, eh? And then John calls out, Oi, Keith! And Keith, the young man who was at the bar with John earlier, walks into the shack's entrance, and as Trevor turns his head to stare at Keith, John says to Trevor with a smile on his face, you stay around him long enough, and everything turns to shit, doesn't it? And Trevor looks at Keith terrified, and he says, "Who's he?" And John lights another cigarette and says, "He's a young copper I picked up on the way here, Trev. You might remember his dad, Bill Ferguson. He killed himself after he fucked up a big investigation a few years back." And then John smiles at Keith and he says, "At the moment, young Keith here is under hypnosis. He won't remember me after I'm gone, but he's just heard every word you said. Isn't that right, Keith?" And Keith smiles and says, "As you like, sir. And do go a bit more careful, eh? There's a good chap." And then John walks out of the doorway past Keith and he turns around to look back at Trevor and he says, "I'd say Keith's been waiting far too long to find the tosser responsible for his father's suicide." And as John walks out the door, Trevor yells, "No, you bloody wouldn't!" And John calls back over his shoulder, "I bloody would." And then he snaps his fingers, and we see Keith's eyes return to normal, like he's coming out of hypnosis. And as John walks away, he hears Keith from inside the building say, "You are well and truly nicked, my fucking beauty." Then we see John sitting on a rock by the beach, and he's having a bit of a meal of a sandwich and an apple. And as he does this, his narration says, "Spectacles, testicles, watch, and wallet. Check. I'm still in one piece then. So what have I learned so far? That I'm an empty shell of my former self who lacks direction?" Then he takes a bite of his apple, and as he pulls away, he sees a worm come out of it, and he says out loud, "Ugh, lovely." Then he sets the apple down next to his sandwich, and he stands up, and his narration continues. "That capitulation to evil is just a form of cowardice. That I've reached the mountain, the next stage in my fantastic bloody voyage, and that it's all uphill for a while." And then we see what John is staring at, and he's staring at a mountain in the distance, and he begins to walk towards it, and his narration continues. "Funnily enough, I know where I am, even though I've never been here before. Mind you, there isn't a working-class occultist worth his salt who hasn't heard of the legend of Ben McDewey. They say surrounding mountains and moorlands cry the blood song for 1,000 lost souls on its slopes. They say that, but no one ever believes them. They tell tales of demons and witches and ghouls that infest every inch of its craggy pathways, and of personal terrors that manifest as faint ghosts right in front of your eyes, and of the Gray Man, the local embodiment of all that is evil in the world, who leaps from the shadows of the mountain and swallows you whole. I believe the stories, all of them, but I've seen this place before, see, 1,000 times in night terror memories. You return disoriented from a missing time experience, and you've just been Ben McDewey. Every time you break your leg or you break your heart, it happens on this side of the mountain. The old hag who sits cackling at the end of your bed when you're a child, she lives here. I can see her looking at me from across the way. And as the fear of isolation intensifies, as the night terrors come swooping down the slopes in the arms of the Gray Man, I hear the skittering of footsteps. I pretend I'm not scared, but that just makes them angry. I feel a sudden surge of evil overwhelm the clearing, carried by the wretched fog. A murmur of misery. And as John stands out on this outcrop of rocks, staring at this mountain, someone behind him says, "A stab of fear." And John turns around surprised and he sees a shadow standing, but he can't make out its face, but it almost looks like a shadow of John, and it says to him, "Hardly surprising, is it? That's yourself you feel, John. Or at least, all the bits you don't want to admit exist." Then we see the flick of a match, and we see the face of this person is revealed, and it is in fact the rotting face of John Constantine, and there's worms underneath the skin wriggling and writhing, and the teeth in his mouth are pointy, and his eyes are completely white with no pupils. So it seems in the next issue, John is going to have to face himself. But we'll have to wait until then to find out, so if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.